They told Iran not to do it, and Iran did it anyway. Here's what nobody in the mainstream press wants to admit. When a nation the size of Iran, sitting on the world's third largest proven oil reserves, with deep military alliances stretching from Moscow to Beijing, makes a move that top geopolitical analysts are calling a serious miscalculation, you don't dismiss that as background noise, you pay attention, because history doesn't whisper, it screams. And right now, it's screaming. The decision Iran just made doesn't exist in a vacuum. It sits inside a much larger chessboard, one where American foreign policy is stretched thin, where BRICS is quietly rewriting the rules of global trade, where the petrodollar system is bleeding out slowly, and where every regional power is calculating exactly how much they can push before someone pushes back harder. And here's the brutal truth. Sometimes the most dangerous thing a nation can do isn't weakness, it's confidence without timing. Iran may have just crossed that line, and the consequences won't stay in the Middle East. They never do. Stay with me, because what's unfolding right now is bigger than the headlines are telling you. Let me start by grounding this in something concrete, because without context, none of this makes sense. Iran didn't wake up one morning and randomly decide to provoke the most militarily powerful alliance structure on the planet. There's a history here, there's a logic here, and understanding that logic is the only way you can actually evaluate whether this decision is, in fact, a serious mistake, or whether it's something far more calculated than the Western press is willing to give Iran credit for. Go back about 4 decades. Iran has been living under the weight of American-led sanctions since 1979, 4 decades of economic suffocation, 4 decades of being told by Washington what it can and cannot do with its own sovereign resources, its own nuclear program, its own regional relationships. And through all of that, Iran didn't collapse. That's the part people forget. The country that was supposed to buckle under maximum pressure, remember that phrase, maximum pressure, that was the official policy, didn't buckle, it adapted, it built alternative trade corridors, it deepened relationships with Russia and China, it developed one of the most sophisticated missile programs in the entire Middle East, not by purchasing weapons from abroad, but by building them domestically. That's not the profile of a nation making reckless decisions, that's the profile of a nation that has been playing a very long game. So when an expert steps forward and says Iran's latest decision could be a serious mistake, the first question I want to ask is, a mistake by whose standard? Because that framing matters enormously. If you're measuring success by Washington's definition of acceptable behavior in the Middle East, then almost everything Iran has done for the last 40 years looks like a mistake. But if you're measuring it by Iran's own strategic interests, by Tehran's internal calculus about survival, regional influence, and long-term power, the picture looks completely different. And that gap between how the West reads Iranian decisions and how Tehran actually understands them, that gap is where most of the analysis goes wrong. Now let's talk about what's actually happening right now, because the current moment is unlike anything we've seen in recent memory. The Middle East is going through a tectonic shift. The Abraham Accords redrew the diplomatic map. Saudi Arabia and Israel came closer to normalization than anyone thought possible just 5 years ago. The October 7th attack and everything that followed blew that process apart and reshuffled every card on the table. Iran, which backs Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis in Yemen, and various militia structures across Iraq and Syria, Iran is at the absolute center of this reshuffling. Every move Iran makes right now sends a signal not just to Israel or the United States, but to every regional actor watching to see how this plays out. And here's where it gets genuinely complicated. Because Iran is not just making decisions about its immediate neighborhood. Iran is making decisions inside a much larger geopolitical context, one where the United States is managing simultaneous pressures in Europe with the Ukraine conflict, in Asia with the Taiwan situation, and in the Middle East all at the same time. American strategic bandwidth is not infinite, and Tehran knows this. The Iranian leadership, whatever you think of them morally or politically, they are not stupid. They have generals and strategists who have spent their careers studying American military doctrine, American political cycles, American election pressures. They know that a nation fighting wars on 3 fronts simultaneously is a nation that cannot bring its full weight to bear on any single one of them. So the question becomes, is Iran exploiting that window deliberately? And if so, where does the risk calculation break down? Because there is always a point, where strategic boldness tips over into strategic overreach. And that's what the experts who are sounding the alarm are pointing to. Not that Iran is irrational, but that Iran may be misreading the room, maybe overestimating how much room it actually has to maneuver before the response becomes something qualitatively different from anything it has faced before. Let me give you a concrete example of what I mean. Iran's nuclear program has been the defining issue of its relationship with the West for over 2 decades. The JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, was negotiated under the Obama administration as a way to cap Iran's uranium enrichment in exchange for sanctions relief. Trump pulled out of it in 2018. Iran, in response, began slowly walking back its own commitments under the deal, and now, as of today, Iran's uranium enrichment levels are at a point that multiple intelligence agencies consider dangerously close to weapons-grade capability. We're talking about enrichment at roughly 60% purity, and weapons grade is considered 90%. That gap is not as large as it sounds in technical terms. The hard part of nuclear weapons development is not the final step. The hard part is getting to 60%. Once you're there, the timeline to 90% is measured in weeks, not years. Now, Iran has consistently maintained that its nuclear program is entirely peaceful, and it's worth noting that no intelligence agency has publicly confirmed that Iran has made the political decision to actually build a bomb. But the capability is being built, and capability in geopolitics is what matters. Intentions can change overnight. Capabilities take years to build. So when you're a country like Israel, sitting next door, watching Iran's enrichment numbers climb month by month, the pressure to act militarily, preemptively, becomes almost unbearable. And Israel has shown repeatedly that it is willing to act preemptively. It did it in Iraq in 1981, it did it in Syria in 2007. The question is not whether Israel has the will, the question is whether it has the capability and whether the United States will back it or constrain it. That's the knife's edge Iran is walking. And here's where I think the serious mistake framing actually has some validity. Not because Iran is wrong to develop its nuclear capability. From a purely strategic standpoint, the logic is almost undeniable. Look at what happened to Libya after Gaddafi gave up his weapons program. Look at what happened to Iraq. The lesson authoritarian states took from those examples is devastatingly clear. If you want to guarantee your regime's survival, you need a deterrent that makes the cost of regime change unacceptably high. North Korea understood this. Iran appears to be reaching the same conclusion. But the timing and the method matter enormously. Because right now, simultaneously, Iran is providing drone technology to Russia that is being used in Ukraine. That's not an accusation, that's a documented, confirmed reality that European intelligence services have verified and that even some Iranian officials have obliquely acknowledged. Those Shahed drones have been killing Ukrainian civilians. They've been hitting Ukrainian power infrastructure. And that puts Iran directly in the crosshairs, not just of American anger, but of European anger. And Europe matters for Iran's sanction situation in ways that often get underestimated. European companies, European banks, European insurance firms, these are the entities that Iran needs to do normalized business with the world. Every drone that hits a Ukrainian city makes that normalization harder, makes the political will in Brussels and Berlin and Paris to push back against American sanctions pressure weaker. Iran is essentially trading medium-term economic normalization potential for short-term revenue from weapons sales to Russia. Whether that's a good trade is genuinely debatable. And then there's the Houthi situation in the Red Sea, which I think is one of the most underreported stories of the last 18 months in terms of its long-term economic and geopolitical implications. The Houthis, who are backed by Iran with weapons, training, and intelligence, have been attacking commercial shipping in the Red Sea at a scale that has genuinely disrupted global trade. Major shipping companies rerouted their vessels around the Cape of Good Hope rather than through the Suez Canal. That adds weeks to shipping times and hundreds of thousands of dollars in fuel costs per voyage. Insurance premiums for Red Sea transits went through the roof. The economic damage, not to the United States, not to Israel, but to global trade, has been significant, and it's created a situation where Iran is now seen not just as a regional spoiler, but as a direct threat to the global trading system that everyone, including China, depends on. Here's the irony in that. China is Iran's most important economic partner right now. China buys Iranian oil in large volumes, helping Tehran survive American sanctions. But China also depends on Red Sea shipping lanes for its own export economy. Chinese goods flow through the Suez Canal to European markets. So Iran's Houthi proxies are simultaneously helping Iran project power and undermining the interests of Iran's most critical economic lifeline. That's not a contradiction that can sustain itself indefinitely, And Beijing has been quietly, very quietly, expressing its discomfort with this dynamic, not publicly, not in ways that embarrass Tehran, but the signals are there for people who know how to read them. So you step back and you look at all of this together: the nuclear escalation, the drone sales to Russia, the Houthi campaign in the Red Sea, the ongoing support for Hezbollah and Hamas, and you see a country that is pressing on multiple fronts simultaneously. And strategically, there's a school of thought that says this is actually brilliant, that by creating so many simultaneous pressure points, Iran forces its adversaries to spread their response thin, that no single front becomes the decisive front, that Iran wins through complexity and exhaustion. There's genuine strategic logic to that. Sun Tzu would recognize it. But there's another school of thought, and this is where the expert warnings are coming from, that says you can press too many buttons at once, that there comes a moment where the accumulated pressure you're creating on your adversaries stops being a strategic advantage and starts being a unifying force, where countries that would otherwise be pursuing their own separate agendas start coordinating against you because the threat you represent has become too large and too diffuse to ignore. And that moment, that tipping point, is extremely difficult to see clearly when you're inside the strategy. It's much easier to see from the outside. And multiple outside analysts, people who are not ideologically hostile to Iran, people who actually understand and respect the sophistication of Iranian strategic thinking, are saying, carefully, precisely, that Iran may be approaching that tipping point right now. What would it look like if Iran crossed that line? It would probably not look like a conventional war. The United States has shown enormous reluctance to get into another ground war in the Middle East after Iraq and Afghanistan. The American public has zero appetite for it. American politicians on both sides of the aisle know that. So the response, if it comes, would likely be something different. Massive airstrikes, certainly, cyber operations on an unprecedented scale, and we've already seen what American and Israeli cyber capabilities can do to Iranian infrastructure with Stuxnet, and that was over a decade ago. Those capabilities have only grown since then. Economic strangulation through secondary sanctions that would genuinely threaten to cut off even China's ability to buy Iranian oil without facing devastating consequences in American markets. And potentially a green light to Israel to conduct the kind of military campaign against Iranian nuclear facilities that Israel has been preparing for, literally, for years. Iran's military is genuinely formidable by regional standards. Its air defense systems have improved considerably. Its missile arsenal is large and sophisticated, but it is not in the same league as the combined military weight of the United States and Israel operating with full political authorization. And that gap, that asymmetry, is ultimately what makes the current Iranian posture so dangerous, because if the strategy of pressing on multiple fronts simultaneously works, it works brilliantly. But if it fails, if the accumulated pressure tips the adversary calculation from deterrence into action, the consequences for Iran would be catastrophic in a way that would set the country back by generations. And that's the tragedy buried inside this story that I don't think gets discussed enough. Because the Iranian people, not the regime, the people, have shown over and over again that they want normal lives. They want economic opportunity. They want to be connected to the world. Every time there has been even a partial opening in sanctions, Iranian society has responded with enormous entrepreneurial energy, enormous cultural creativity. Iran is a country of 90 million people with one of the highest literacy rates in the Middle East, a deeply sophisticated historical and cultural identity, a young population that overwhelmingly wants integration with the global economy rather than isolation from it. The geopolitical games being played by the Iranian leadership and by Washington, let's be honest, because Washington's maximum pressure policy has caused extraordinary suffering for ordinary Iranians, those games are being played on the backs of people who never chose this confrontation. That's the human dimension of what gets lost when we talk about geopolitical mistakes in the abstract. A serious mistake at the strategic level isn't just a miscalculation on a map, it's a decision that will determine whether millions of ordinary people live in dignity or in ruins, whether a country with enormous potential spends another generation under sanctions and isolation or finds a path towards something better. The expert who is warning that Iran's decision could be a serious mistake is not just talking about strategic chess pieces, they're talking about the real-world consequences for real human beings on every side of this conflict. So where does this leave us? Genuinely uncertain. That's the most honest answer. Iran's strategy has defied the predictions of Western analysts repeatedly over the past 4 decades. It survived the Iran-Iraq war. It survived maximum pressure. It survived Israeli assassinations of its nuclear scientists. It survived Stuxnet. Every time the conventional wisdom said Iran was on the verge of collapse or capitulation, it didn't collapse and it didn't capitulate. Maybe this time is no different. Maybe Iran has calculated correctly again, and the experts sounding the alarm are underestimating Tehran's resilience and strategic depth. Or maybe this time, the accumulated overreach has genuinely created a set of conditions that are qualitatively different from everything that came before. Maybe the combination of near weapons-grade nuclear capability, drone warfare in Europe, and Red Sea disruption has crossed a threshold that previous Iranian pressure campaigns did not cross. And if that's true, if the expert warnings are correct, then the next chapter of this story is going to be one of the most consequential geopolitical events of the decade. One that reshapes the Middle East, strains the global economy, tests the limits of the American-led international order, and forces every major power to choose sides in ways that will define global politics for years to come. The decision has been made. The question now is what comes next. And that answer, we're all about to find out together.